Now, in the previous video, video 15, we discussed how Lenin was at first on his own amongst the Bolshevik leadership in trying to redirect his party towards a policy of building for socialist revolution. And paradoxically, the main cause of Lenin's isolation was the old Bolsheviks' belief in Lenin's own general slogan that had long called for the building of the Democratic Dictatorship of the Proletariat and Peasantry. The party had always argued that only the unity of these two classes could guarantee that the bourgeois revolution would sweep away the old feudal refuse of monarchy and landlords. In the words of one of these older leaders, Olminsky, the coming revolution must be only a bourgeois revolution. That was an obligatory premise for every member of the party, right up to the February Revolution of 1917, and even some time after. This is why Lenin's opponents argued that since the bourgeois tasks, such as the confiscation of landed estates, had not yet been carried out, there was no place for talk of socialism or a Paris Commune-style proletarian state power. As the old worker Bolshevik Trotsky argued, the democratic dictatorship is our foundation stone. We ought to organise the power of the proletariat and the peasants, and we ought to distinguish this from the commune, since that means the power of the proletariat alone. Now, Lenin countered these arguments in his Letters on Tactics. He quoted Engels, pointing out, "Our theory is not a dogma, but a guide to action." What did he mean by that? Well, Lenin explained how Marx and Engels had always ridiculed the mere memorizing and repetition of formulas that at best are capable only of marking out general tasks. When these can offer only general outlines that have to be modifiable by the concrete economic and political conditions of each particular period. So Lenin pointed out bluntly that his old formula was already antiquated. He understood it now needed to be modified in the light of actual events, because a new situation had arisen where, in Lenin's words, reality shows us both the passing of power into the hands of the bourgeoisie and, side by side with the real government, the existence of a parallel government which represents the revolutionary democratic dictatorship of the proletariat and the peasantry. In a direct response to Kamenev's criticism in Pravda, Lenin asked, "Is this reality covered by Comrade Kamenev's old Bolshevik formula?" It is not. The formula is obsolete. It is no good at all. He explained, a new and different task now faces us, to effect a split within this dictatorship between the proletarian elements and the petty bourgeois elements. The person who now speaks only of a revolutionary democratic dictatorship of the proletariat and the peasantry is behind the times. Consequently, he has in effect gone over to the petty bourgeoisie against the proletarian class struggle. In other words, whereas Lenin's old formula in the past correctly explained the need for the workers and peasants to rely on their own forces, clinging to it now meant supporting the very bourgeois power that was incapable of carrying out the tasks of the bourgeois revolution. Lenin knew full well that the bourgeois tasks of the revolution had not yet been carried out, but understood that Soviet activity could carry out these tasks far more effectively than any parliamentary republic. Furthermore, the Soviets were exactly the essence of the Paris Commune type of state, relying on the masses' own participation in decision-making, and with no army standing apart from the people. Therefore, although not calling for immediate socialism, as Kamenev was alleging in Pravda, Lenin saw that the Soviets, once freed from the influence of the compromisers, could certainly begin to take steps towards a socialist society. And in answer to those Bolshevik leaders like Rykov, who argue that the socialist revolution must begin in the industrialized West before backward Russia could begin to move towards socialism, Lenin replied, "You cannot say who will start and who will finish." As Lenin had said in his farewell letter to the Swiss workers, confident in particular in spurring on the German workers, here, in other words in Russia, socialism cannot immediately conquer, but our revolution can be a prologue to the worldwide socialist revolution. In this sense, Trotsky wrote, Lenin first wrote that the Russian proletariat will begin the socialist revolution. And this perspective of international socialist revolution, being sparked off by the movement of the Russian workers and peasants, was, as Trotsky says, the connecting link between the old position of Bolshevism, which limited the revolution to democratic aims, and the new. Lenin now saw that the only way forward was, in Trotsky's words, the preparation of a union of the workers and peasants under the leadership of the Bolshevik Party. That is, the dictatorship of the proletariat. Now, looking back to previous videos, you will see that Lenin was in effect taking up the idea that Trotsky had put forward in the theory of permanent revolution. The idea that the Russian proletariat might win the power in advance of the Western proletariat, and that in that case it could not confine itself within the limits of the democratic dictatorship, but would be compelled to undertake the initial socialist measures. It's not surprising then, says Trotsky, that the April theses of Lenin were condemned as Trotskyist. Trotsky then explains how Lenin was concerned that the old Bolsheviks might be underestimating the ability of the peasantry to act as an independent force, not as a socialist ally of the workers, but as an obstacle to them. On the one hand, he warned that it is not permissible for a proletarian party to rest its hopes at this time on a community of interest with the peasantry. We are struggling to bring the peasantry over to our side, but they now stand, to a certain degree consciously, on the side of the capitalists. To try and attract the peasant now means to throw ourselves on the mercy of Mulyakov. On the other hand, Lenin was at pains to point out that his policy was not to ignore the peasant movement, not to argue for some kind of proletarian coup, but to patiently win over the Soviet majority, in which indeed the peasantry dominated, through the soldiers as much as anything. So at the same time, Lenin advised careful attention to the agrarian question, urging the Bolsheviks to propose that the peasants should rely on their own initiative to seize the land, putting it under the control of the peasant Soviets, instead of waiting for the Constituent Assembly, as the compromises directed. It should be an ordered takeover that would actually then help increase food production for the workers and soldiers, not hinder it. However, the idea running throughout Lenin's thinking was that the workers must not rely on the whole peasantry. This could lead to the revolution being held back in fear of alienating the wealthier elements. Instead, the aim had to be to split the semi-proletarian labourers and poor peasants away from the more capitalist layer. As Lenin wrote in April, we cannot confine ourselves to the general Soviets of peasants' deputies alone, for the wealthy peasants are also capitalists and are always liable to wrong or cheat the agricultural labourers, day labourers and poor peasants. Therefore, separate organisations for these groups of the rural population must be set up immediately, both within the Soviets of peasants' deputies and as separate Soviets of deputies from the agricultural labourers. In fact, as we shall see in upcoming videos, The agrarian revolution did indeed develop, but with the antagonisms within the peasantry themselves being far less significant than the antagonism between the peasantry as a whole and the landowners. Therefore, as Trotsky puts it, the Soviets of farmhand deputies attained significance only in a few localities. The land committees became the instruments of the whole peasantry, who, with their heavy-handed pressure, converted them from chambers of conciliation into weapons of agrarian revolution. Now, from now on, Lenin and Trotsky put forward essentially the same perspective for the revolution, if one which really confirmed Trotsky's original idea of permanent revolution. Of course, the differences between the two leaders had never been as great as the Stalinists later tried to make out in any case. Trotsky himself was unable to take part in the debate within the Bolsheviks in April, since he didn't reach Petrograd until May the 4th, after the British Naval Police had prevented him from travelling earlier on a ship from Canada. Nevertheless, the similarity of his analysis with Lenin's is clear in the articles that Trotsky was writing at the time for Novomir, a Russian daily paper in New York. Trotsky includes some of these articles in a useful appendix to the first volume of his history. And in them you can see that as early as March the 6th, Trotsky had written that an open conflict between the forces of revolution, at whose head stands the city proletariat, and the anti-revolutionary liberal bourgeoisie temporarily in power, is absolutely inevitable. The revolutionary proletariat ought to oppose its revolutionary institutions, the Soviets of workers, soldiers and peasants' deputies, to the executive institutions of the provisional government. In this struggle, the proletariat, uniting around itself the rising popular masses, ought to make its direct goal the conquest of power. Only a revolutionary workers' government will have the will and ability, even during the preparation for a constituent assembly, to carry out a radical democratic clean-up throughout the country, reconstruct the army from top to bottom, convert it into a revolutionary militia, and demonstrate in action to the lower ranks of the peasants that their salvation lies only in supporting a revolutionary workers' regime. And he goes on March the 8th, to say that the agrarian question would drive a deep wedge into the present aristocratic bourgeois social patriotic bloc. What personal choice Kerensky makes will make no difference. It is another matter with the peasant masses, the rural lower ranks. To bring them over to the side of the proletariat is the most urgent, unpostponable task. It would be a crime to try to accomplish this task by adapting our policy to the national patriotic limitedness of the village. The Russian worker would commit suicide if he paid for his union with the peasant at the price of breaking his ties with the European proletariat. But there is no political need for this. Trotsky demonstrated his absolute confidence in the leading role of the working class. And back in chapter 16, Trotsky sums up the post-revolutionary situation as follows. The peasantry always has two faces, one turned towards the proletariat, the other towards the bourgeoisie. But the intermediary, compromising position of peasant parties, like the social revolutionaries, can be maintained only in conditions of comparative political stagnation. In a revolutionary epoch, the moment inevitably comes when the petty bourgeoisie is compelled to choose. The social revolutionaries and Mensheviks made their choice from the first moment. They destroyed the democratic dictatorship in embryo in order to prevent it from becoming a bridge to the dictatorship of the proletariat. But they thus opened a road to the latter, only a different road, not through them, but against them. Through their representatives, the masses were drawn, partly against their will, partly without their consciousness, into the mechanics of the two-power regime. They now had to pass through this in order to learn by experience that it could not give them either peace or land. But it is quite evident that a political turning of the workers and soldiers towards the Bolsheviks, having knocked over the whole two-power construction, could now no longer mean anything but the establishment of a dictatorship of the proletariat, resting upon a union of the workers and peasants. In case the popular mass had been defeated, only a military dictatorship of capital could have risen on the ruins of the Bolshevik Party.